vulnerability assessment. So we drew heavily from the sensitivity database for these. And this is a fairly busy slide, hopefully the busiest of the presentation, but we had a lot of different funders. The case studies themselves were funded by the Great Northern and North Pacific LCCs. And then there's a whole host of partners that, as Michael mentioned, were integral in getting the actual data put together that we used in this. So the goal of these case studies was to really take all of these multiple lines of evidence that we have, and I'll go over what those are, to assessing species vulnerability to climate change and integrate them into, and really focus on specific species in specific landscapes. So we wanted to see how this would work and how this could inform management on the ground. So our general approach was to start out with using inherent sensitivity as kind of our baseline. So we just had a great presentation on what that means. So just looking at the individual case study species that we selected, and for each of them relying heavily on expert and published knowledge. So some of the information is experimental, are experimental studies, but a lot of it is expert opinion on how sensitive these species are to things like temperature change and precipitation change. So just how do they respond to climate change? And then the next step was to take a look at what the direct impacts were. And we're thinking of these direct impacts as how the climate is projected to change. So we use downscaled climate models to look at then for each of these species, the variables that they were particularly sensitive to, how are those projected to change? And then another tool that we used were the climatic niche projections, which are also known as climate envelope models or range shift projections. And I'll talk about those more in detail in a minute too. And then lastly, we wanted to look at the full complexity of a species or ecosystem. So we tried to get as much as possible at indirect and interacting impacts from climate change. And so to do this, we looked at mechanistic models that incorporate a whole range of processes, including things like dispersal, competition, fire, and as well as climate change. And then we also looked at some of these kind of complicating factors like changes to fire regime, interacting species, and diseases and pests. And we wanted to pull all of this together, and these assessments were largely qualitative in terms of our overall assessment. They did have some quantitative aspects to them. And we kind of think of this as increasing in complexity. So we're starting out, as Michael kind of mentioned, sensitivity in some ways is kind of our baseline. We understand as much as we know about the ecology and physiology of individual species, we do have a fairly good handle on that for at least a lot of species. There's more uncertainty in terms of how the climate is going to change, and that adds a lot of complexity. And then once you add in interacting species and complicating disturbance regimes, things start to get very complex. So we also have increasing uncertainty as we move in this direction. So the specific data that I'll talk about today are information pulled from the sensitivity database, and we also did look at other peer-reviewed articles, and downscaled climate projections, these climatic niche models and we were looking primarily at tree species and vegetation systems, and those were conducted by Michael Case as well. And then also these mechanistic vegetation change projections. So those are the dynamic global vegetation models. And everything that I'll show you today, all the maps that I'll show you, are for the A2 emission scenario and projected out to the 2080s, as you know. So there are a number of challenges with trying to pull together all of these different data types. There's a wide range of different types of data and information. The scales all vary from the level of the individual organism up to very broad biome types. And so, and the uncertainty associated with each piece of information is critical, as well as each piece has its own strengths and limitations. So that's a challenge. It's also a strength of pulling together all those different resources. One of the other large challenges that we dealt with is trying to understand what it means when you get different potential futures once you look at all of this information. So first of all, there's uncertainty in terms of how the climate will change. So you might get a very different answer from a model if you feed in a climate model that says the future will be drier versus one that says it will be wetter. And then there's also differences depending on which model you use. So if you use a mechanistic model, you'll get a different answer from a statistical model. So how to kind of reconcile those differences and how to develop a coherent storyline that managers can really use and hold on to was kind of our objective here. So to do this, we looked at 3 case studies. We looked at the sagebrush steppe on the Columbia Plateau, whitebark pine in the Pioneer Mountains of Idaho, kind of in the southeastern area of Idaho, right here, and then Oregon white oak in the Willamette Valley. And those, the species were selected out of a series of workshops that we did in each of these case study landscapes as priorities for the managers that were there. So I'm just gonna start out by giving you a couple highlights for each of our case studies on some of these different categories. So for inherent sensitivity, we did already get a little bit of insight into whitebark pine, but it's a species that depends on high elevation cold sites and depends on summer snowmelt for seedling establishment. So both of those things are not helpful through the lens of climate change. The species is also sensitive to changes in fire regime and is under existing stress from mountain pine beetles and from blister rust pathogen. So based on that information, the species gets a very high sensitivity ranking. Oregon white oak has a fairly wide geographic distribution, north to south. So that's helpful because it's already adapted to a range of temperature conditions. It actually benefits from warm, dry conditions, and so historically in this region, when the climate has been warmer or drier, that species has done better. However, it is very dispersal limited, and it is also sensitive to changes in fire regime as well. So that one gets kind of a yellow-green color, sort of moderately sensitive. And then lastly, sagebrush steppe has a wide geographic range. It does have locally adapted genotypes to different climate conditions. There have been a number of experimental studies that have looked at how it responds to climate changes such as reduced snowpack and warm temperatures, which may actually improve seedling establishment, at least at high elevations. And then there's studies showing that moisture changes will have different effects, sometimes beneficial, sometimes negative, depending on local soil conditions. So that one also gets kind of a moderately sensitive ranking. So next we looked at the climatic niche models. So if you're familiar with climate envelope models, this is another kind of another name for that. And essentially what these models do is they statistically characterize the climate conditions within a species' current range and then use climate projections to identify where those conditions will be in the future. So they do not account for dispersal, competition, evolutionary adaptation, or carbon dioxide fertilization. There's a whole host of other considerations that are not part of this. So it's really just looking at climate suitability and asking where is the climate currently occupied by the species or system expected to be in the future. And then I'll show you the results for each of our case study species. So this is for whitebark pine, and this red area was our study area landscape that we were working in. And there's a lot going on in this map, but essentially what you need to look at is the orange color are areas that are currently within the range that are expected to become less climatically suitable. So it's a contraction of suitability. The areas in green are currently suitable and expected to remain suitable, so those can be considered stable. And you can see from looking at this pretty quickly that it's mostly orange. So this is a high elevation species. As temperatures warm, the range is expected to contract upslope. So this is not a positive perspective or future for that species. In contrast, this is Oregon white oak. So you have in green the current range, and that's also projected to remain stable. So currently climatically suitable and expected to remain climatically suitable. And these blue areas are areas that are not currently suitable but are expected to become suitable. So again, as this is a species that does well in warm, dry conditions, as the summers may get hotter and drier, it actually may have the opportunity to expand to slightly higher elevations. Again, this is just climatically speaking. And then lastly, sagebrush steppe. Because sagebrush steppe was a general vegetation type, we looked at a couple different components of it. So this top map is showing big sagebrush, the species, Artemisia tridentata. And you can see the Columbia Plateau outlined in red. And then this lower map is for the vegetation system, Intermountain Basin, big sagebrush steppe. And again, the green is stable, blue is expansion, and orange is contraction. And these paler colors are where there was less agreement among the different climate scenarios. So there were 5 different climate scenarios modeled, and in this case, probably only about 2 or 3 actually agreed that this area would contract, and otherwise it would remain stable for that species. So there was a little bit less agreement. In the other maps, there was pretty strong agreement among the different climate scenarios. And also, you can see that it's a much more complex picture. So we have some contraction, some stability, and some expansion. And one thing that we noticed, and we did look at a variety of other similar analyses as well, and this northern area of the plateau actually tended to pop out as remaining stable and or perhaps providing room for expansion, whereas the southern area looked like it would be more of a contraction. So that was kind of a useful bit of information to get from looking at a lot of different maps. So just quickly, I'm going to show you just one example, because there's a lot going on in these maps, of the results from the mechanistic vegetation models. So we have here, this is the modeled historical vegetation, and pink is sagebrush steppe. And so what I want you to notice, and again, these mechanistic models incorporate a whole variety of different processes. So these do have carbon dioxide fertilization, they have competition, they have fire thrown into them. And then these other panels are the 5 different projected future vegetation for that region. So the first thing to notice is that this pink virtually disappears in all of the scenarios. So sagebrush steppe contracts substantially. There's a couple little smears of it in these 2 scenarios. The other is that this yellow color is grassland, and there's 3 scenarios, there's 3 climate futures that really are kind of dominated by grassland, and then there's 2 that are dominated by this green, which are different forest types. So for a manager, what you're looking at here is, well, maybe you'll have grassland in the future and maybe you'll have forest. That's pretty tough to deal with. So not to say that we have any great solutions for that, but, and then looking at the climatic niche projections, we do have a fair amount of the area remaining suitable for sagebrush. So those are really conflicting potential futures. And so one of the ways we tried to think about that was, well, the area may be climatically suitable for sagebrush, but competition and other interactions might reduce or eliminate that suitability. So it's not that one model is right or the other is wrong, it's just that they're looking at very different perspectives. And then in terms of the grassland versus forest, it turns out that the grassland projections are all a little bit drier, the forests are all a little bit wetter. So that gives you some information when you start monitoring which direction climate change is moving. That might give you some indication of which of these futures you're going for. But also, unfortunately, useful to know that there's a lot of uncertainty there. So just to summarize, we've got, for white bark pine, we found a lot of convergence in the information that we reviewed. So, and unfortunately, the convergence was that that species is not going to do very well in that area. But it was, we gained certainty by looking at all those different pieces of information. With Oregon white oak, there was a fair amount of certainty that things wouldn't be terrible, and climatically it might be actually improving, but there are other factors that may be detrimental. So there's still uncertainties there. And then sagebrush steppe had a lot of uncertainty, as we kind of just looked at. So we can also kind of highlight those in their same colors. So just to conclude, we found that reviewing all of these different data types was really critical because we would have missed important information if we had just looked at one piece of the puzzle and discarded some models over others. The degree of convergence depends on the case study that you're looking at. Sometimes you might gain certainty, sometimes you might gain uncertainty, but either way, it's very useful to know kind of where you stand. And apparent disagreement can highlight either uncertainties for future research or just different processes, so climate versus competition. And then finally, we found that partnerships between land managers, field experts, and modelers were really essential because each of those individuals and groups had very different perspectives on the species. And so they were able to highlight gaps or limitations of some of the different pieces of evidence that we were reviewing. So making this as collaborative as possible is very important. Thank you. I'll just leave that acknowledgement sign up and then take questions at this time.